Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined here by Law&Crime legal analyst Dan Schorr. We're going to break down all of the biggest live trials and legal stories in the news today. Got a lot to cover, so let's get started right now. And thanks, Rachel. Interesting case. Yesterday, we saw the testimony of that surviving witness, Charles Verpagel, who helped the state point the finger at the defendant. Vasata's attorneys tried to portray Verpagel as a criminal who was embedded in vendettas and illegal dealings, things that the jury should really consider. On the stand right now, and we will jump live in a second, is one of the lead detectives in this case, Danielle Hirsch. She just testified that Vasata claimed he was an innocent guest at his friend Verpagel's house that night of the shooting. But Verpagel said that's not true. He wasn't a guest. So that's when the defendant became a person of interest. But right now, I want to go back to Dan Schorr, who's also a managing director at Ankara. I want to ask you about this. What is your take as we enter into day 6 after everything we saw yesterday with Charles Verpagel?
It's difficult for the prosecution because, and this happens in a lot of cases where your star witness is also someone who has committed crimes. And that happens when you're dealing with a bunch of people who are involved in some kind of criminal activity. So they're relying on the homeowner, Verpagel, or the renter to say, this is who was the culprit here, but he had weapons, he had drugs, he was involved in this, he was talking about how he was discussing possibly wanting to eliminate somebody. So he's not very credible, and that plays into the defense side where they're saying he wasn't there as someone trying to target other people, that he was actually a victim here. But then again, why was he there in the first place? He wasn't a guest at that party, it seems like. So there's a lot of contradictory information.
Yeah, who to believe? Who shot who? What was going on? We have a lot to break down, but before we do that, we're going to jump live right now. We'll hear more from this lead detective. Okay, so we're learning more about how these bullets are matching up to the defendant, and the bullets that were found in his pocket match the bullets that were found in the BMW that he was dropped off by, or he was next to, and also the bullets found by that Honda, you know, that were recovered by where the murder weapons were. So we're trying to get a better sense of how they're attaching him to this, but what do you think the line of questioning is looking like, and what are we gaining from this testimony?
Well, they're trying to flesh out the crime scene, and that serves two purposes. One, ultimately, they want to connect the bullets and any other evidence they can to Vasata, but it also makes it very real, talking about what was at the scene, what was found, it shaping it out for the jury so they actually can envision it and see it, and that sometimes helps them connect emotionally in addition to logically to what happened there.
Is this a strong case against Vasata?
It is if you believe the main prosecution witness about his identification. Other than that, you do have the bullets that may connect him. There may be other evidence to come, but there is a side for the defense to say, look, I was shot, I was a victim here. How was he shot? There's 2 other people, one who has been charged, one who hasn't, who allegedly, according to some people, might have been part of this. So the defense definitely has some things to work with in terms of trying to establish reasonable doubt.
And as this lead detective said at the beginning, the reason Vasata became a person of interest is because his story didn't match up with Charles Verpagel, who you could argue is the state's key witness, because the defendant said he was a friend at Verpagel's house that night when he got shot. Charles Verpagel said he wasn't a guest that night. He wasn't supposed to be there. So it's going to be up to the jury to see who they believe about what actually happened. Okay, so let's break down what's happening here. Are we getting the sense that perhaps, you know, the defense always wants to say there was another person there, and they keep pointing the finger at Luke Kasoukas as the real shooter here? Are they doing a good job? I mean, they just said when you see the vehicle and the 2 people come out of the vehicle, you don't see anyone carrying that rifle that was used. So what do you think?
Right. Not only that, but they're pointing out the things that weren't tested. She's saying, oh, we seized all this evidence. We tested it for DNA. Well, you didn't. I think she mentioned a water bottle, some bottles, some other things. You didn't test those. And that's standard cross-examination against a detective to say, well, you didn't do everything. You didn't look under every rock. Maybe there's some information you're missing, and maybe that points to someone else besides my client. So they're doing the standard cross-examination to try to show some reasonable doubt in an incomplete investigation.
I was trying to see more from Charles Verpagel's testimony, but I didn't get what I was looking for there. I was expecting him to point the finger at the defendant, defense saying, you're the one who really, you know, something like that. It wasn't so clear-cut, was it?
Well, it's tough because supposedly the people who came in were wearing masks. The ID isn't totally clear.
Well, there's no masks that were found.
Right. So there's a lot that's incomplete, but certainly they could ditch those masks. If people did come in with masks, they fired guns, they could certainly ditch those somewhere. So there's an explanation for it, but the prosecution is the one, as we always say, with the burden of proof, and they have to show that this defendant is the one who was one of the shooters. And that is hard to establish without an ID. You have the bullets, you have him dropped off, you have him at the scene. He was shot, which kind of shows that he might have been a victim here, or maybe he was shot with a someone who is part of his
listen.
posse of people who is attacking this party. There's a lot of different things that might have happened here.
Yeah, he could have been shot by accident, but let's not forget there were a lot of guns. There was a lot of drugs in that house, and Mr. Verpagel is actually serving a federal prison sentence related to the seizure of those guns and drugs. I think what they're trying to do is put more of the focus on Luke Kasokis. They're showing this photograph of the defendant and his injuries. What are you looking at here?
Yeah, they're trying to establish there is someone else that might be a suspect here, and it's great if, as a defense attorney, if you can show there's another person out there who might have been involved, might be responsible, and therefore your client's not responsible. So they're trying to establish that. They'll probably try to poke holes in the defense, in the prosecution's explanation for why they didn't arrest him. They're talking about this alibi that he supposedly has.
Do juries like that? Do they like that alternative suspect, kind of like it's in the movies, the man who got away? Do they feed on this?
Well, I think anytime you could paint a complete story that people can hook onto, it's helpful. And this is the type of story that there does seem to be interest in. A juror would say, well, he's saying he's framed. There's this other guy out there. He's involved in this storyline somehow. He might have been involved, and therefore let's take that person as a possible suspect, and that's reasonable doubt. So it does make sense if they believe it.
Especially maybe when you haven't seen a clear explanation about why he was cleared. Have you seen that, why he was cleared?
Not yet, but I would suspect that the prosecution will show more evidence about that alibi if the defense keeps raising him as another suspect. They're going to have to flesh out, well, why wasn't he arrested?
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe we'll hear more of it in closings. We're waiting to go back live in a second and see what's happening. Actually, I think we can. Let's go back and we'll hear more of this questioning. Good witness for the state?
Well, he establishes some of the basic facts, that there was a shooting there, that there were multiple shooters, and he can't identify anyone specifically, so that doesn't make the case for the prosecution, but it does lay the scene for it. And he could also talk about some of the conflict that was going on in the players that were involved beforehand that maybe puts the defendant at the scene that way.
Is there any reason not to believe his testimony? I mean, he's in prison. He's serving 8 years, I believe, for federal guns and weapons charges. Any reason not to believe what he's saying here?
Well, one reason to be skeptical is there's a lot of conflict, whether it's physical or verbal beforehand, among all these players. They were arguing over drugs and guns, and it seems like there were a lot of phone and text messages. So what loyalties there are between those people, it's unclear. And certainly there was a lot of illegal conduct by this defendant and this victim and other people. So whether or not that leads to this defendant being the shooter here, we don't know, but that is something that compromises his integrity as a witness, the fact that he was involved in criminal activity. He did give different accounts to the police initially. So whether everything he's saying is 100% solid, the defense has a lot of room to undermine that.
What's sad as I look at this is he's such a young guy, Verpagel, young defendant, young victims, being involved in illegal activity, and he's testified yesterday they were all doing drugs at the house, there was guns all over. It just seems like a shame from a lot of different angles.
Absolutely, it's a major loss of young human life. 3 people who were at a Super Bowl get-together, Super Bowl night get-together, shot to death, and the 3 people that were shot, at least 2 of them, the 2 women, don't seem to be involved at all. In the messages going back and forth. Maybe the 3rd victim was, but still there's no showing that he was involved in any criminal activity.
But for Verpagel too, and if he's ultimately convicted, Vasata, these young people were involved in criminal activity. That seems to be the tragedy as well.
Absolutely. It's a huge tragedy of all these lives that are either ruined by jail time or by being murdered, or this defendant may go to prison forever. He's facing the death penalty. So the carnage from this one night and this conflict is really unfathomable.
It really is. Okay, so as we're trying to identify who the shooters are, what do you make of that testimony?
It's interesting because originally he said that he told police that he thought Kasukis might be one of the shooters, but that description saying that was a black person seems like it's not Kasukis. It's interesting that he says he can't recognize the defendant as a shooter. That actually adds credibility to other things he says, because if he's going to be fabricating a story, why doesn't he just add, oh, and I recognize the defendant?
Sure.
So the fact that he's saying, I couldn't actually recognize him, that kind of corroborates other things he's saying. But again, it doesn't really show that the defendant was at the scene. There's other things that show him at the scene, and he ultimately says that I was at the scene, but I was shot and I wasn't one of the shooters.
Well, he does say he notices someone being carried away who was shot and put into a car. And again, the defendant himself has said, well, I was shot, I was carried away. I don't know who shot me, I don't know who carried me.
Right, but that alone doesn't mean that he was a shooter or not a shooter, because he could have been one of the shooters and get shot and carried away.
Yeah, no one's
right?
denying
Right.
he was there, and no one's denying that he was shot. It's just what role did he play?
Right, exactly, because he was in that car that was moving away, and then he was dumped on the side of the road or put on the side of the road, and he was shot. But was he just? It seems less likely that just a guest at the party would just be then brought away in a car. There doesn't seem to be any reason for that. It seems more likely that someone who's one of the co-conspirators, someone acting with them, would then be taken away from the scene after he's shot. So that seems to hurt the prosecution.
Yeah, it does.
I mean, help the prosecution.
Well,
sorry.
but let's see what happens when he was under cross-examination by the defense. Again, they really want to poke the hole in the prosecution's theory and say that Luke Kasokis is the person that really fired those guns. All right, my expert is with me right now. Dan, how does this tie into the case?
It's about the collection of evidence and what was found, what was not found. I think these are little loose ends that they're trying to make clear points about, but there's no bombshell there. There's no major evidence. There's nothing connecting this defendant to the murder scene. They're just really showing what they did and how thorough they were.
Does the jury sit back and say, all right, I don't know what's going on here. I'm just going to wait for closing arguments to see how this ties in?
To some extent, because when there's all these little facts that don't seem significant at the time, sometimes in closing arguments, the prosecution or the defense will bring them up and say, remember when I asked this witness X? Well, the reason I did is because that ties into Y. So maybe there'll be a connection later. Sometimes the prosecution just wants to show how thorough they were. So maybe it doesn't point to something showing the defendant committed the crime, but part of the defense argument here is the prosecution wasn't thorough in every way. So they're maybe trying to show that they were.
That's a really good point. Also, never cough on Law&Crime again, okay?
Excuse me.
Never, ever cough on Law&Crime.
I know the president doesn't like that, and you guys don't like that either. So.
All right, we're going to take a break, and we're going to get Dan some water, and then we're going to come back. We'll be live. Stay tuned. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're still trying to understand exactly what happened 2 years ago at on a Super Bowl Sunday when 3 people were gunned down. Who were the shooters? Who was responsible? What exactly happened? And we're learning more details today in our live trial of the Christopher Vasata case. Now, Dan, you had mentioned to me in our break that perhaps what the prosecution is saying, there is another suspect, but they just don't know exactly who it is. I mean, we keep hearing about Luke Kasokis. Why was he not charged? Why was he not implicated? Maybe the prosecution didn't have enough evidence against him.
Right. The prosecution's saying that there was an alibi for Kasokis, and the defense is saying that alibi really wasn't solid. But the thing here is there are multiple shooters at the scene. That's not in dispute. So it could be that Kasokis was a shooter and that this defendant also was. So whether or not Kasokis was involved doesn't really clear the defendant. If he was, as the defense is trying to imply, maybe he was a real shooter. Well, their client also could have been a real shooter.
Let me ask you this. When you have such a chaotic event like a shooting, multiple victims, multiple shooters, bullets, guns everywhere, the cases that you have seen, have they resulted in successful prosecutions? Because you could imagine, as we keep talking about, as things get more complicated and who saw what, it's hard to positively identify the shooters. Maybe there's some reasonable doubt there. So have you seen successful cases? Have you seen unsuccessful cases?
Yeah, I've seen them both. And the thing is, if there's multiple shooters, it's hard to piece together exactly who is shooting who, which bullets were from who. But what you can do is, if someone's part of a group of people that are firing shots, there's intent to be part of that group, and therefore intent to kill, even if that person doesn't specifically shoot the victim. So if you and I go into a room and start shooting people and you're the one who actually killed them, I can still be convicted of murder because I'm part of that. And also, if people are shooting against each other, there could be the still intent to be part of that conflict and then kill the other people who are shot. So yeah, it's hard to piece together the facts, but legally, you're on the hook for anyone who's killed if you intentionally take part in a shooting.
In other words, that what he's charged with doesn't mean he wanted to kill the 3 victims. They're saying he wanted to kill Charles Repagel, but they died as a result. That's why the first-degree murder charge strikes?
Right, and that's called transferred intent, that if you have the intent to kill one person, and as you're intending to kill that person, you kill another person, it's just as if you intended to kill that person. You have the intent to kill, and your intent leads to an action that does result in someone's death. And that is the same as if you wanted to kill that other person. Okay,
well, here's what we just learned. The state has officially rested their case. The last witness that they called was victim Brandy El-Sahi's sister, confirming the car that her sister was driving at the time of this event. And now they just rested their case. Dan, the defense, they're going to a lunch break right now. The defense is going to begin their case. We believe they may call one witness, might be an early day in court. If you were representing this man, you now have the case. Your first witness, the jury's watching. Who do you call?
It's unclear who they would call. They don't have, like, he's at the scene, so they don't have an alibi witness, obviously. Maybe they could call a character witness. The bigger decision is, are they going to call the defendant? And that is a really tough decision there. That takes a lot of discussion with your client as the defense attorney. What is the defendant going to say? Can he explain away some of the bad facts here? Does him telling his story help create reasonable doubt, or does it just open up more avenues for the prosecution to go at him? So I think that's probably what this discussion is going to be about over lunch.
I hate to say this, but I'm curious. The first time we saw him was he was in a wheelchair because he was shot and he was brought into court. If he was still in that wheelchair, if he was still suffering from the effects of the gunshot wound that was visible, wouldn't that make him a sympathetic witness? So if the defendant was injured himself and you bring him on the stand, the jury might say, oh my gosh, look at this guy, you know? But here, if they bring him on the stand and he talks about being shot and really elaborates on that and shows himself more as a victim, then maybe there is something to bring him on the stand.
It's possible, but as you talked about before, there are 3 young people who were murdered here. So if he's part of the group that killed those 3 people and he was shot in the crossfire, there's not going to be much sympathy for him.
Especially when he had bullets in his pocket and he's going next to a BMW that they're saying that they're attaching to him, and there's bullets, there's a rifle case in there. These bullets match up to a revolver that was found believed to be one of the murder weapons. So why would he have this if he was just an innocent party?
Right, and look, these people that were at the party, at least some of them, we know were involved in some criminal activity. Even the star witness for the prosecution is involved in criminal activity. So just the fact that they are armed doesn't mean that they were involved in committing this murder.
What happens if he came with his friend Luke? I'm creating a hypothetical. Came with his friend Luke, who's like, we're just going to talk out with Vorpago, we're going to ease the tensions. But then Lucas Sukis, or whoever the third, Marcus Stewart, who's his co-defendant, decides to open fire and take things, and he's just there. He's just there, the defendant, and he gets shot. Is he still a murderer? Is he still...
No, he's not. If he didn't have any intent to commit criminal activity, then he would not be guilty of murder or responsible for murder. For instance, if they were saying, we're just going to rob him but not shoot him, then he might be guilty under the felony murder rule for murder. But if he's just there to work it out, settle this beef, and he ends up getting shot, then he's not going to be someone who is actually guilty of murder based on those facts.
So Dan, you're saying there's at least some avenues here for the defense to explore and raise some reasonable doubt.
They can raise reasonable doubt, but there are obviously a lot of facts that point to the defendant being responsible. He doesn't seem to be an invited guest. There are people who come into this party and open fire. That's not in dispute. He is connected with them in some way. He is connected to these bullets in some way. And that together kind of shows that he was involved here. Now, he can say the prosecution wasn't thorough. Right. There's this other guy out there who they said had an alibi when the alibi is weak. And my guy, the defense attorney talking, wasn't responsible. But those are the things that you're going to hear.
Well, and that's what we're going to wait to see. But Dan, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate your insight as always.
Always great talking with you.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, a lot more to discuss. Stay tuned here on Law&Crime.